Hi, welcome to Board Gems, a video series in which I want to share with you my love of an older board game gem that is not talked about much anymore. The game I'm covering this time is Masons. Now, Masons originally came out in 2006 and has not had any reprint as far as I know of since then, although there is a sequel of sorts, which I'll get to. Like the last game I covered, Medina, this game has a great pedigree, also published by Hans and Glück, my favorite board game publisher, and this one is designed by Leo Colovini, who, like Stefan Dorr for Medina, Colovini is one of the patron saints of this channel, I feel. He has a design philosophy which I happen to agree with and enjoy quite a bit. Usually very simple concepts, but there's a hidden depth to them. I've also covered Carolus Magnus, as well as Cartagena, two of his more famous games. This is one of his less famous games. It originally came out in 2006. It was among a slew of Hans and Glück games that were kind of, I would call them family plus. Like if you think of Carcassonne, which is Hans and Glück's most popular best-selling game by far, which is a very family weight game, Hans and Glück has always been known as having a little bit more meat on the bones, and so there were a lot of games released between, well, even before 2000, but I'm in particular thinking of this time period between in sort of the mid 2000s, in which there were a lot of family weight board games, but just had just a little bit extra, right? That little bit of a next step. So Masons is one. I would include Attica and Tuluva, Turn and Taxis, Stone Age, Hanging Gardens. There's an Oregon. There's a number of games that released kind of in this time frame in sort of the late 2000s. That Hans and Glück was really focusing on that, and that happens to be my jam. I happen to like those sort of family weight plus games. Vikings is another one. To me, like a lot of these games have a longevity to them. They have just that perfect combination of variability within the game mechanisms compared to variability in what the players do, and enough strategic depth but still simple enough to learn. It's almost like a forever game. It's for 2 to 4 players, ages 8 and up, I think. Takes about 45 minutes, so that's pretty fair. This can be described as the type of game in which players are taking turns modifying the game board state, but players have secret goals, and they are able to score them when the game state looks a certain way or a certain thing happens. This is, I would almost say, is kind of a more modern trend, and games that came out sort of in its wake would include games like Takenoko, for example. It does a similar thing. Wasabi does another similar thing. And these games all came out after Masons. Generally, I don't like that style of game, but I like Masons, and I'll try to explain why after I show you how to play. To set up the game, place the board on the table between the players, shuffle up these gold cards, and deal 6 to each player. Gold cards are different ways of scoring points. I'll go over a few of them later, but each player is going to start with 6. Keep the dice near the board. Each player has a scoring marker, and they're going to start off the board. The board starts at 1, and the rest of the wooden pieces you're going to keep nearby. You can leave them in the box, although it is good to know how many of each type of piece are left. What are the types of pieces? We have walls, we have towers of 3 different colors, we have houses of 5 different colors, and palaces, again, of the 5 colors of the houses. The game ends when all of one type, walls, towers, houses, or palaces, are gone. So players do need to be able to keep an eye on how many of each are left. But that's it, you're ready to begin. Pick a start player, play as clockwise. On the player's turn, the first thing they do is they place a wall. And they place a wall on any line between 2 circles. Walls that surround a space is considered a city. And you can't place walls inside a city. After you place the wall, you roll the dice. 1 is a tower die. it shows the 3 different colors of towers, and these dice would show the 5 different colors of houses along with the wild. You know, in some old school games, it's very common to pass the dice, and that's the first thing you do, like in Monopoly, you know, roll the dice. There's actually a rule in this game that if you roll the dice before placing a wall, you lose a point and then you take your turn again. Anyway, place the wall, then roll the dice. The tower die shows what color of tower has to be on one end of the wall. Each wall has to have a tower on either end. So this player must play a gray tower here or here. After they do that, they will have to put a tower here because there isn't already a tower, but they can choose the other color of tower. These dice show what color of houses had to be placed on either side of the wall. In this case, they were both yellow. So that's pretty easy. Place a yellow house there and a yellow house there. If they were 2 different colors, then the player could choose which side to put which house. And if they had placed the wall on the edge, they're only placing one house, so in this case they could choose which color house to put here, yellow or red. If a city is not formed, that's all that happens. Play continues to the left. But if a city is made, that is, a space is completely surrounded by towers, then players may play scoring cards from their hand to score points for the state of the board as it is, or the city that has currently been completed. Best to show with some examples, so I'm just going to play through the game a little bit, and let's see how that works in practice. So now, one player has placed a wall to create a city. They still roll the dice, but they ignore the tower die because there's already towers on either end of the wall. But you still do this, 1 red and 1 pink. The player who completed it is going to look at their hand, and they are going to play 1 or 2 cards from their hand to score. You can play up to 2 cards, but at the end you're only drawing 1. So as you play 2, your hand is going to gradually get smaller and smaller. This player may play this card. This card says, if the city is of 1 triangle in size, score 6 points. They may choose to play another card. They will choose this one. Now this one is referencing a part of the board. You'll see there's no walls around it, so this is everywhere other than inside a city. Broadly speaking, the board is split up into 3 different areas, and they're represented by these 3 different coat of arms here. And they're delineated by this kind of yellowish line. So this area is for this coat of arms. This card represents this coat of arms. So this is scoring 1 point for every house outside of a city in this area. So let's count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Not this one, this is in this area. So another 5 points. And then that player discards those cards and draws 1 replacement. So they started with 6 cards, now they only have 5. Now every other player in clockwise order has the chance to do the same thing. They can play 1 or 2 cards, after which they will draw 1 replacement, or they can pass. They don't have to play any cards. If they don't play any cards, then they may discard a single card from their hand and then draw 2 cards. That may be a better option than scoring 1 card and not getting very many points for it. So each player has the opportunity to do that. At the end, you look at the score. Whoever is in last place then has the option of exchanging as many cards from their hand as they want and getting all new ones. So they pick a number of cards from their hand, discard them, and draw replacements. There are a couple of more rules regarding cities, so let's keep playing. So So now we have made a city. We still roll the dice. No tower. But we'll add a red and a blue house. Well, in this case, because we put it on the edge, we only put one down. Let's put a blue down. And again, we score. But before we score, the player who made the city, who just played the wall that finishes the city, has an option. Because this city is next to an existing city, they may combine the two. And if there's more than one city, they can choose one of the two cities to combine with. In this case, there's just one nearby city, so they can choose to remove all the walls between the newly formed city and the existing city. And if they do, the wall simply comes off like that. You'll see that there's multiples of each house. Houses in a city may be combined into palaces. At this point, it doesn't matter what space they're on. You can in fact move them around if you want and group them by color. And in this case, every pair of houses of the same color gets replaced with a palace of the same color. This is important because some cards will score additional points for palaces. This card, for the completed city, will score 3 points for every yellow palace inside the city walls and 1 point for every yellow house inside the city walls. Let's add a few more in here. And again, the player would be able to choose whether to combine this city with this adjacent city. And if they choose to do so, all the walls in between come off, get returned to the supply, and this tower also. And again, you would look. You'll see every pair gets replaced with a palace. And at this point, players may play cards from their hand in order to score. Let's talk about some of the different scoring cards. This scores 1 point for every house outside of a city in this area. So this is defined by this section here. 2 points for every gray tower in the completed city. 2 points for every black tower not in a city. 1 point for every palace of any color inside the completed city. 0 points for every house, just 1 point for every palace. You'll notice that some cards are better later in the game when there's bigger cities and more palaces than earlier. And that's a big part of the game is card management. Maybe getting rid of cards, exchanging cards that are not good at this point in time, but maybe later on you will draw better cards for the situation. This one, 1 point per city, regardless of its size. 1 point for every blue house not in a city. 2 points for every tower not part of a city that's along the coast. And you can see there's 2 coasts. 9 points if the city just being scored is of size 7 or more. 1 point for every wall not part of a city. This one's a little confusing. You count the number of different colors in the city that is just being scored. If there are 2 or 3 different colors, you score 4 points, and if there are 4 or 5 different colors, you score 7 points. That's just an example of some of the cards you may see. So remember, walls, houses, and towers that are removed from the board because cities are being formed or merged get returned to the supply. Only palaces will stay on the board for the entire game, for sure. The game ends when all the walls have been placed, or all the towers have been placed, or all the houses of all colors have been placed, or all the palaces of all colors have been placed. If at the time the supply is depleted, you're also building a city, finishing a city, you still score that city. Otherwise, the game will end. And the player with the highest score wins. In the case of a tie, the player who has the most cards left over that they didn't score in their hand wins the game. That's it. You're ready to play Masons. Now, when you see Masons, you're going to think that the main game, the main strategy, the main gameplay is all happening on the board, right? That's what most of your turn is. You're going to be taking turns putting down a wall, rolling dice, putting towers on either side, putting houses on either side, possibly surrounding an area, choosing whether to, combine it with a neighboring area or not, and then choosing cards to score. When you think of it like that, you're going to feel like the game doesn't have a whole lot of control, because you choose where the wall goes, but you only have a little bit of choice in terms of what towers go on and what color houses you're going to put down. A game or two into it, you're going to feel like, I don't know, it feels like a little bit random. You have to kind of break yourself of that mentality. If you're going into this game, remind yourself, the game is not on the board so much as it's here in your hand. The game is ultimately a card hand management game. There are a number of different ways to score points based on the cards that you have. And once you play the game a few times, you learn what types of cards there are. And when you see people, for example, if you see one player putting a wall next to the water, then you're like, okay, well, I think they're going to score towers, next to the water, right? And you can kind of remember or keep an eye on what other players are doing to kind of judge. But moreover, you actually, compared to a lot of other games, like I mentioned, like Takenoko, like the recipe games like Wasabi, where you have a secret sort of, you have to do this, and only when the board game state looks like that can you score it. No. In this game, you actually have a lot of control as to what cards are in your hand. Now, the cards are random draws, but you're choosing, whenever a city is completed, you're choosing which card to play, and importantly, how many. If you play 1 or 2, you draw 1 card. If you play 0, you actually get to discard a card from your hand and then draw 2. Is it worth it to score one of my cards? And how much a card is worth, that's critical. If I play this card now, it gives me 4 points. It's okay. If I hang on to it for later, it might score more. But maybe I should score this other card instead. Of course, I could play both. I could play 2 cards. But then I'm only drawing 1. Is that worth it? And you're timing it also so that you're gonna hopefully be playing most of your cards by the end of the game. So if you have good opportunities early and you're playing those cards, then later on your hand size is becoming smaller and smaller and smaller, so you're going to have less choice going forward, right? It can also be the case where you're being too cautious. You're playing cards, you're not playing enough cards, and the game will actually possibly end before you have a chance to play most of them. After a single play, you might go like, oh, well, I didn't have much control over what cards I had in my hand, right? Oh, this card scored for greenhouses outside. There were hardly any greenhouses outside of cities. Bad card. What do you do with it? You can discard it and draw 2 new ones that might be better. And if you are falling behind, if you are in last place, then after a city scores, you have the opportunity to basically flush your entire hand, discard as many cards as you want and get new ones. So you always have options. And I feel like that's something that a lot of these, I don't really know what to call them. They're a shared state, but everybody has secret goals. So there's the game board state, which is changed by the players, but everybody has their own secret goals, so you don't really know what other people are going for necessarily. Wasabi, for example, is also this type of game, but in that game it has like a recipe. So sometimes I call them recipe games, where you're trying to get, a certain combination of things. But it's not like you're necessarily collecting them. It's not set collection. You're trying to get the board state to look a certain way, and then you can score based on that. But games like Wasabi, you don't have a choice, right? The game starts with a certain number of recipes you're trying to fulfill. And Takenoko, now it's been a while, but I don't think there's an easy way to flush cards that you have in your hand. I actually really, really like Mason's approach. And it's interesting because it's one of the early games that did that. I'm trying to think of an earlier game that did that, and I'm sure there are, but they're not coming to mind at the moment. But this is how you do it. I mean, Metropolis Way is good too, where you have a limited number of secret goals, but you also have public goals, things that score for everybody. So at least you still have some idea of whether you want to stop a player from doing something that they're doing. Like if they're seeing the players trying to do something, maybe you can stop them, right? Because you know that, what's potentially out there, but also you can see, well, they're obviously going to score 5 points right now, right? That's another way to do it, but Mason's Way is really good too, because it just provides a huge variety. They're still all within like a certain limited, maybe a dozen different types. But of course, there's variety in each of the types, right? So there's houses inside the city being scored. There's houses outside the city being scored. Individual colors of those. So there's variety in there. Different colors of towers, or where the towers are located, how big the city is, how many palaces are in the city, how many different colors are in the city. Once you play it a few times, you kind of learn what's out there. And as the game state changes, as the board changes, the value of what's in your hand changes. Some cards become worse, some cards become better, and a big part of the game is judging what to do with them. Do you still play them, score fewer points? There's a potential that they might score more later, but maybe not. I like when not making a decision is also a decision, if that makes sense. Where you can play 1 card or 2 cards, but you can also choose to play 0 cards. And that's still a perfectly valid choice because it gives you a different benefit. So it just adds an extra dimension to it. Going into the game, I think it's important to keep that in mind, that obviously the game is scored based on what's on the board. But if you think of the game as a strategy game in which what's happening on the board is the strategy, you're going to feel like the game is random and you might end up being a bit disappointed. But when you realize the strategy is the card play, the strategy is in here. This is not incidental. The board state is not incidental to it, but that's not where the strategy is. That's sort of a random thing that's happening. You have a limited amount of control over it. The strategy is in here. I like to think of the game as a speculation game more than anything. The cards that you have will have different values at different times, and a value of a card may go up or down based on the state of the game. So the speculation comes in from deciding whether it's worth it to take a medium amount of points now, maybe medium to low number of points now, or hanging on to it, hoping that it'll score more points later, but it might not, or even just getting rid of the card and giving you a chance to get random better cards. Leo Colovini is a very experienced designer, and he has a type of game. He has a goal in mind often when he's designing a game. And some of these designers that have been in the industry for a long time definitely seem to have different approaches than the modern designers coming in. I feel like a modern designer would be tempted to add even more variety in the Mason's cards. And I think they would be tempted to add multiple ways for an individual card to score. So a card might show 2 different things, right? Score for this or score for that. Hey, it's more choice. More choice is good, right? That would slow the game down. Mason's is a nice, simple, clean design. That sort of thing, to me, just adds cruft and slows the game down. This game is a super fast game to play. This is something that doesn't get a lot of appreciation, I feel, nowadays. Do you know the setup time for Masons? Virtually 0. You put out the board, you shuffle the cards, you deal out the cards, that's it. There's no counting out different, pieces for different numbers of players. There's no sorting out cards or anything. It's a super simple game to set up and just start. As someone who doesn't play as many games as they would like, they just don't have the time, that's something I really appreciate, when you can take a game and it's like, we're playing Masons? Okay, well, great. And within 60 seconds, you're playing. Now, because some people can play 2 cards at once, and maybe other players may decide to play 1 or even to play 0, what you often see in the game is potentially one player kind of shooting ahead, right? Or multiple players shooting ahead, or at least one player starting to fall behind a lot because of the different approaches. Some players may be playing a lot of cards early, but maybe those scores are good but not great. Maybe it's right for the player who wants to hang back a little bit and save their cards for later, or take the opportunity to refresh since they're in last place. Still, for a new player unfamiliar with the game, if they make that choice and they see as a result that on the scoreboard they're falling behind, I just think it's important to let people know comebacks are definitely possible in this game. A player can treat it like a sprint, or they can treat it like a marathon. Some players will have opportunities early and they'll play cards early. But later on, those opportunities may dry up. They have a smaller hand of cards. Maybe they have to spend time playing nothing and then discarding cards and drawing 2, building up their hand back, right? Deciding to hold back is a perfectly valid strategy, but that means early in the game, you're not scoring as many points. So when you see that score kind of differential, it can put people off a bit, when they're the ones falling behind and they're like, oh my God, I only have 10 points and they have 30. How am I going to possibly catch up? It's like, no, don't worry about it. Comebacks are possible, and whoever's in last place gets to flush as many cards as they want and from their hand and replace them. That's actually a really, really good benefit to have. I like to remind new players of that. Like, don't get frustrated if you're falling behind, right? It's different approaches to the game. Some players are going to score points early. Some players are going to score points late. Give it the whole game and see how close the scores end up being. I do also appreciate that the end game is kind of controlled by the players a bit. You're not playing X number of rounds. You're playing until all of a thing is gone from the supply. So all the walls, or all the towers, or all the houses, or all the palaces. And that can make for some interesting decisions too. Because let's say it's nearing the end of the game, you have a lead, and you complete a city. It might be worth it from your point of view in terms of points from the cards that you can play to combine it with another city. But that returns the walls connecting them back to the supply. When the game can end is not necessarily super variable, but the players do have some control over it. So if you're in the lead and the walls are diminished, they're almost gone from the supply, then you may not want to merge cities, even though it might technically score you 1 or 2 more points based on the cards that you play, but you might try to want to end the game early, so you don't want to return walls to the supply. I wouldn't say it's a huge part of the game, but the fact that that is a factor, it just tells me that, there's more to the game to explore. I've played it a number of times, only a couple in person. Most of it has been on Yucata. Yucata? I don't know how to pronounce that. Which it's great there, although fair warning, there's no confirmation button, so whatever you choose, that's it. Think before you click. But the implementation works great there, definitely is worth a try. I don't necessarily encourage viewers to hear my positive things about Masons and to go, oh, that's amazing, I have to have it, and they immediately go out and find a used copy. No, don't do that. This game wasn't hugely popular even when it came out. Used copies are pretty easy to get, but even still, try it for free. Sign up if you haven't already on yucata.de, yucata.de, and play games for free there. And play it multiple times, and get a feel for it before you decide you want to seek out a used copy. Or you may not want to seek out a used copy, because there is a sequel of sorts that came out just a few years ago, is also designed by Leo Colovini, and has a lot of visual similarities to Masons. Castello Mathoni? I should have looked up how to pronounce it. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it. This is from Korean publisher Mandu Games. The board state looks very similar to Masons, in that the board is split up into triangles and you're placing walls on the triangles, and eventually you're building cities. I have not played that game. I do have it, obviously, but I've only read the rules. Story of my life. And the games do play out very, very differently. Castello Mathoni seems to be more, I would say, more of a strategy game, and definitely an extremely interactive game, which Masons isn't so much, right? You're all changing the board state, but except for being aware of what other goals players might be going for based on the cards they might have in their hand, it's not a particularly interactive game, which is probably, for me, it's its only downside. And I suppose the board maybe looks a little drab, but it's just an older style, honestly. Wooden pieces on a kind of unsaturated board. Hey, it's the look works for me. If you like the style of the Family Plus style games that Hans and Glück makes, or at least used to make quite a bit, of which Masons and Oregon and Hanging Gardens and some other games that I've covered and more that I will cover, it may be worthwhile if you like that style of game, because that style of game isn't quite made as much anymore. And there are games, more modern games, that do similar things, where you have the board state that is controlled by the players, and players have secret goals. To me, I like to compare the game favorably to Takenoko. And a lot of the more modern games that use this formula are more like Takenoko's style. The board state, which you have quite a bit of control over, but you have less control over what your goals are. So your goals are kind of random. Maybe you just start with a bunch at the beginning of the game, for example, and then you're modifying the game board state, and you have a lot of control over that, and it's the chaos of the other players. So you have more control over the board, but less control over your goals. Masons, one of the early games of that style, flips it, where you have not very much control over the board game state, but you have a lot of control over what goals to score and when to score them, and whether to even score them, whether to get rid of them and try for new ones. Think of Masons like a speculation game, and in that sense, it works really, really well. Okay, it doesn't look as cute as Takenoko, but if I had to choose between playing Takenoko and Masons, I would actually choose Masons. Just personal preference. If you like the style of games that I like, you might also like Masons. But before you just go out and buy it, which is something that surprisingly quite a few of my viewers seem to do, they just go out and buy games just because I like them, which, hey, I appreciate, but do your own research, you know what I mean? I'm just one guy who happens to like a certain style of game. And you know what? Maybe there are some games that you and I agree on, and maybe there are other games that we won't agree on, and maybe Masons is one of those. So I do strongly recommend trying it online, playing a few games before seeking out a copy. But yeah, I really like the game. I love it as a 3-player game. 2 players, it just takes more to get it going. You know, that first part of the game just feels so plodding, you know, taking turns putting walls down, right? The more players you have, the faster that boring start, the faster you get through that part. But when you have too many players, like with 4 players, it still works completely fine. Yeah, I mean, I guess 4 players is fine too, but 3 players for me is a sweet spot anyway. And I'm always looking for good 3-player games, so yeah, happy to have Masons. Thanks for watching. Remember, older games like Masons don't stop being good just because newer games come out. Take care.